And we're back. It's Kat, and I'm back. Game of Thrones. I'm going to talk about that in some very short videos. I've already said numerous times. Shout out to all the phenomenal folks that are doing a great job. Gillen Itamar, Game of Thrones Academy. You got to see them to believe them. Then there's Civilization X. Everything you could possibly want to know about Westeros and Game of Thrones and any back history, that's where you want to go. Rawris, because she's funnier than hell. She does a breakdown of the videos and talks about some potential things to come. And then there's Emergency Awesomeness, and I dig him because he catches all the little stuff that sometimes I think gets missed. So shout out to all those folks, and everybody else is doing a great job. I'm going to talk about some of the ideas that I had that may in fact be covered in any number of other videos out there regarding it, but I hadn't seen them. So, forgive me if I'm recreating the wheel, so to speak. So, look at all the other videos. I talked about Roman history. I've talked about Nordic legends of Niflheim, the land of always river and always winter, and Helheim, and the Great Walls. And then there's, Ragnarok. We talked a little bit about Greek mythology. And the underworld and the Clash of the Gods. So far we've talked about at least two different apocalyptic myths through other civilizations, and this one I want to do a quick talk about Christianity and biblical histories or stories that also go along in Game of Thrones. And of course, George R.R. Martin, he was raised a Catholic, and some aspects of his Catholicism play through in the Game of Thrones, like the Faith of the Seven, and things of that nature. So, but let's talk about, for instance, the Wall in the underworld and the coming apocalypse that everybody keeps talking about in the Game of Thrones, and everybody keeps saying, "Winter is coming, winter is coming." Winter is coming. So everybody gets that it's not just winter like our winter, but something really big and terrible, the big winter. History of Westerosi, and the men, first men come, they duke it out with the children of the forest. They agree on where they're all going to live. At some point, the big, long winter comes and the long night, and the others come down out of the north and almost wipe everybody out. And then Azor Ahai comes, the Messiah. Shout out to Gil and Itamar at Game of Thrones Academy. They fight back the others, and they push them north. And the winter ends. They build a big wall. Brand the Builder builds the wall, or somebody builds the wall. Children of the Forest imbue it with magic. They keep them back there, keep the others up there until the next time that the apocalypse is going to come. So, reflective of Christian theology, one of the things that I wanted to point out, for instance, was Dante's Inferno and the 9 circles of hell. If you've ever looked up Dante's Inferno and what the different levels are for, in a certain time period of Catholicism, there was this idea that nobody was without sin. So even if you're saved or been baptized or whatever, you don't automatically go to heaven. That in fact that you would die and you would end up in one of the upper levels of hell, like purgatory, where you would do time there as redemption, the wall, for redemption, and before you would rise to heaven. And that, of course, every level that you went to was worse and worse, and there was all these different things that you could suffer based on what kind of sins you had committed. And in the Dante's Inferno, in fact, the 9th circle of hell, the lowest level, was a land of frozen waste. There was a giant frozen lake, and in this lake, Satan was frozen, and that's where he was kept, so he couldn't come out and walk on the earth and commit all these atrocities, but at least so long as it stayed frozen. And the worst sinners that Dante said would inhabit this frozen area are traitors. So think about that for a second. Traitors occupy the frozen wasteland of the 9th circle of Dante's Inferno. So, what we know about the Night's Watch is that the guys who were the traders on the Night's Watch tried to go north into the frozen waste. They were traders to their kind, to the Night's Watch, and either they ended up staying there or they ended up dying there, and they stayed there in the frozen hell. Some other aspects, I think, that are pretty obvious. Gillen and Tamara already discussed this, that, there's aspects of the story where the waters rose up and broke the land and of Westeros, and the long night that seem to reflect Gilgamesh and or Noah. Gilgamesh is the Babylonian version. Noah is the Christianized version of Gilgamesh in the Great Flood. And that when it was all over and the waters receded, two people, two of every species existed, and they repopulated. So that's aspects of the biblical, but I think one of the aspects that 40 days and 40 nights, I'm sorry. It was 40 days and 40 nights of darkness and rain, by the way, before it receded. So that's kind of the long night. I didn't want to miss that. Some other aspects, of course, is the idea of the veil being the wall. And what do I mean by the veil? Well, in many folk faiths, or even in biblical tradition, there is a veil between the living and the dead. In some superstition for folklore, there's a veil between the magical and the non-magical. But also in biblical tradition, Jesus Christ, when he was buried in the tomb and rose alive, and then ascended into heaven alive, is said to have rent the veil in the temple. And what that means is he rent the veil between the sacred and the mundane world. So that it was no longer, the mystical, the sacred was no longer beyond men. That in fact, your regular old dude out in the world could have access also to this sacredness and to the potential of eternal life. So, if he whosoever believeth in him shall not die, but shall have eternal life. Okay, so there's a little bit of the Nordic versions and the Greek mythology, a little bit in regards to that. But like Greek mythology and Nordic mythology, Jesus, Jon Snow, Azor Ahai, is the only guy. He's not the only guy, but he's one of the two people that we know biblically in the New Testament that actually went into the grave and came out alive. The other one was Lazarus, whom Jesus rose from the dead. Kind of like Melisandre and Jon Snow, right? So Jesus went into Lazarus' tomb, and he'd been dead for 3 days, and Jesus rose him. So it kind of presaged Jesus rising from the tomb as well. So everybody else, once you go in the grave, you don't come back. But of course, in Christian faith, biblical stories is the Revelations, which talks about the apocalypse. So let's talk about. Sure, there was, according to the Bible, an original or an earlier apocalypse in which man was almost wiped out, but ended up, God let him start over. In Revelations, it talks about the coming apocalypse, and that it has a number of signs. And I think that you see this a little bit in the Game of Thrones. Number one, my favorite, the Whore of Babylon comes out of the desert riding a dragon with 7 heads and 7 crowns. And she convinces all of these kings to join her cause. And they start committing these horrible wars. And there are wars upon wars, and people are dying all over the place, and famine and plague. And the famine and plague comes because the Lamb, which everybody assumes means Jesus living in heaven, breaks the 4 seals, and out pop the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. So, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse are famine, pestilence, eternal war, and then the last one Here comes a pale rider on a pale horse, and he is death. All right, so backing up a little bit, Daenerys with her dragon, and she's getting all the kings of the other countries to go with her. She's obviously coming out of Babylon Vastothraki. And she is bringing the apocalypse with her. Okay? And then the four horsemen of the apocalypse are all the bad things that are going to happen. But I thought the most physical representation of that was there's this one video or this one shot of the four commanders of the others sitting on their horses. So you get the Q-on visual of the four horsemen of the apocalypse. So there's your Christian bibliography. Now, one of the aspects that it talks about is that at this point, guess what happens as the four horsemen pour down? Just like in the Nordic myths, the dead are raised to join the armies, Hell's army, fighting with the frost giants against the gods. In the Revelations, as the four horsemen come and death finally comes, all those who died, unshriven or unsaved or whatever it is, they will rise in the army, in Death's army. And they will sweep across the rest of humanity, and then there's the big there's the day of resurrection, where all the good and faithful go to heaven, and all the rest remain in hell. And if you're a poor slob who's still alive after the apocalypse, and you're either in hell or been raised to heaven with the righteous, you just stay on earth and suffer whatever horrible things keep happening over and over again. And the one thing the Revelations doesn't say is whether it will start over again. So, Ragnarok says, the cycle starts over again. And in fact, the Greek mythology doesn't really even say that all of man is wiped out. It just says it's twilight of the gods, and the gods are gone, and a new age begins. But in Christian theology, Revelations, they don't tell you. Everybody goes to heaven or not. And they don't tell you whether God starts over again. So that's the big question. So there's your Christian faith, Christian concepts that George R.R. Martin included in the Game of Thrones. So just recapping all of these theories, this is the Game of Thrones. Winter is coming. And the potential, either it's a new age, it's either just a new age, or it's the complete apocalypse. All right, stay tuned, because I did want to talk about a couple other things that are kind of obscure and not really talked about much on the Game of Thrones yet, and it might not even be included in the series, but there are some that are definitely in the books that I definitely wanted to make reference to. So thank you very much. I'll talk to you later. Bye.